Hello everyone, welcome back. In today's video, we got a couple of things to discuss, including a couple of signings, including a major one in Tampa. We also have a retirement to talk about, a couple of more PTOs have been signed, and we've got some trade rumors involving the Nashville Predators, Montreal Canadiens, Anaheim Ducks, and the Calgary Flames. And we'll go to all of that coming up right now. Hello everyone, welcome back to another video here at the Internet Hockey Channel. Now, as usual, I'll kick things off today by discussing a couple of signings that have happened recently from around the NHL. So we'll start with the Winnipeg Jets. Over the weekend, they signed one of their last two remaining RFAs in Logan Stanley. Stanley was an RFA. He was a guy who asked for a trade at around the trade deadline, never got it. I was still wondering if he was going to be traded. I still do wonder if he possibly is traded before the season starts. But he gets a one-year deal with AAV of $1 million. For Stanley, it's not too bad. He was a former first-round pick back in the 2016 draft by the Winnipeg Jets, has been playing consistently at NHL level over the past 3 seasons, only put up 3 points in 19 games last year, had multiple injuries that kept him up for a while, plus he sort of lost his spot in the top 6 to a guy like Dylan Sandberg, so he sort of fell out of favor in Winnipeg. This is why he probably asked for the trade close to the trade deadline. There was no trade so far this offseason. The Jets have had bigger things to focus on in Scheifele, Hellebuck, Wheeler, and Dubois, so they haven't really been able to move him, but they do have a crowded blue line. I do wonder if Stanley's even going to try and make the blue line, because they do have a couple of decent defenders. Like they have DeMello, they have Pionk, they have Morrissey, they have Schmidt, they have Sandberg. Hagel is trying to get an NHL spot. They have Chisholm, who's not waivers exempt this year. They have Capobianco. So they have a ton of defensemen. So I do really think it's going to be extremely hard for Stanley to make the NHL roster. So instead of risking putting him on waivers, sending him to the minors, I do wonder if the Jets still try and move him. His contract's not too bad. 1 year, $1 million. He'll be a RFA at the end of the year. He's a big defender. He's not going to put up too many points, but he's shown that he can be a really good physical third pair defenseman. He can put up points at some points as well. So I still do wonder if Stanley gets moved, but at least they get another one of their RFA business done and getting Stanley done. So it's a solid deal in my opinion. It's definitely a really good deal. I think Stanley's definitely worth $1 million, and it's definitely interesting to see how good his training camp goes and if he can make an NHL roster out of training camp for the Jets, or if he's possibly going to be moved somewhere else. So going to be interesting to see, but Stanley's definitely going to be a name to watch with the Winnipeg Jets over the next couple of weeks. Next we go over to another signing that happened recently, and that is with the Philadelphia Flyers, as they have signed right shot defenseman and first-round pick in the 2023 NHL entry draft, 22nd overall, Oliver Bonk, to a 3-year ELC with an AAV of $950,000. So for Bonk, he was the 22nd overall pick by the Philadelphia Flyers. He was a solid draft selection by Philly. That was the Flyers' second draft selection in the first round of this past year's draft. They took Michkov 7th overall, and then they took Bonk 22nd overall. Bonk seems to have some really good potentials, possibly a top 4 defenseman in a couple of years' time. And it's coming off a pretty good season, picking up 10 goals and 40 points in 67 OHL games this past year. So he should have a really good sophomore season playing over in juniors. I expect him to go back to playing over in juniors this year. Probably going to play in juniors this year, then either play the juniors or the AHL next year, and then maybe in 2 to 3 years' time, he should definitely be able to challenge for a regular NHL roster spot. I don't think he'll have too much trouble, given the fact Philly has a weaker blue line already, so in a couple of years' time, when he's ready for the NHL, he should be able to nab an NHL roster spot, and should eventually be a extremely solid top 4 defenseman for the Flyers. So, in my opinion, that's a solid deal for the Flyers. I think Bonk signing a 3-year ELC is fantastic, and hopefully he does a good season over in juniors this year and can continue his development, so in the not too distant future he can challenge for an NHL roster spot. And then lastly here, just before I started recording this video, there was a signing that just happened for the Tampa Bay Lightning. As the Tampa Bay Lightning extended RFA in a year's time, Brendan Hagel to a 8-year contract extension with an AAV of $6.5 million, and they'll begin at the start of next season. So this is one of a few major extensions that have happened this offseason. We had Sorokin on day 1 of free agency sign an 8-year extension. A little bit later we had Aho sign an 8-year extension, and then Wilson recently signed I think a 7-year extension. So the Hagel signs an 8-year extension, joining those 3 as major long-term extensions that have happened this offseason. Hagel's a left winger. He's a fantastic player. He was drafted by the Buffalo Sabres, but really got his first NHL opportunities with Chicago. Played with Chicago for a couple of years. Put up 9 goals and 24 points in his rookie season, putting up 52 games. He also had 21 goals and 37 points in 55 games in the first half of the 21-22 season with the Hawks, before the Hawks moved him to the Lightning. Lightning got him, he put 4 goals, 7 points in 22 games, which wasn't half bad. But this past year, he had a fantastic season, putting out 30 goals, 64 points in 81 games. So he looks like a fantastic player. As I said in last week's season preview video for the Lightning, I expected Hagel to be top-line minutes for the Lightning because he's such a good top 6 forward. So I think giving him a $6.5 million contract is pretty good. He does only have 1 year making over 45 points. So I do think there's a little bit of risk involved just in case he doesn't hit that level of game again next year. But he's a really good forward. He's a fantastic left winger. He's a really good top 6 forward. He can play well with guys like Kucherov and Point. In my opinion, this should be a fantastic deal for him. It might be a little bit risky going long term with him, but he's only 24 years old. So this contract will expire when he's 32 years old. So I don't think it's too much risk involved. He's shown in Tampa he can be a fantastic top 6 forward. I think the 8 times $6.5 million deal is good for them. It does eat up a lot of cap space for next year, and they do still have to extend captain Steven Stamkos, but this had to be done eventually. He was an RFA. He was going to get a big raise. I think this is a fantastic deal for the Lightning. So definitely, love to hear your thoughts on the Hagel deal down in the comments. Is this a good deal for Tampa? Did it overpay too much? Is it too much long term? Definitely love to hear your thoughts down in the comments, but I think this is a pretty good deal, and now Hagel's going to be with the Tampa Lightning for at least the next 9 years. So going to be interesting to see, but Hagel's now been extended by the Lightning, and he's now going to be a major part of that Tampa Lightning team for the next couple of seasons. So that's all signings we're going to get to here today. Pretty good signing for Hagel, good signings for Bonk and Stanley as well. Next we go over to the retiree part of the video. Now there was a recent announcement from Jonathan Bernier announcing that he has been retired, and he is retiring from the NHL. So Bernier has been a solid goaltender for the past number of seasons in the NHL. He's bounced around a little bit. It was a first round pick, 11th overall in the 2006 draft from the LA Kings, which is where he started his career in the 07-08 season. He had played his first 5 seasons, first full 3 seasons, but parts of his first full 5 seasons with the LA Kings. Was also a member of the LA Kings team that went to the Cup and won it in the 2011-2012 season. So he is technically a Stanley Cup champion, even though he didn't really play at all in that playoff run. It was all Jonathan Quick, but he was the backup to Jonathan Quick. So he was partaking in part of the Stanley Cup champion LA Kings in the 2012 season. Then 2 years after that, the Kings wound up moving him, traded him to Toronto, where he spent the next 3 seasons. Then he would spend a year in Anaheim in 16-17, a year in Colorado in 17-18. Would spend the next 3 seasons in Detroit, playing with the Red Wings. But the Red Wings were at that point a rebuilding team. They couldn't make the playoffs. And then they spent the 21-22 season with the New Jersey Devils. And then he suffered an injury late in that season that kept him out for the rest of that season. And then last year, that injury kept him out for the entirety of last year as well, which is why Vanacek, Schmid, and Blackwood were the goalies for the Devils. So definitely, I think the injury was a big part of the reason why Bernier is called it quits at this point in time. He's been a fantastic goalie, playing over 400 games at the NHL level. He's also played 9 playoff games. He hasn't been able to play in a ton of playoff games throughout his career. Like I said, he was part of the Kings 2011-2012 Stanley Cup run. He got into 1 game during that Cup run. He also played 4 games in the playoffs during his time in Anaheim. He got into 4 games in the playoffs during his time in Colorado. But besides that, he never made the playoffs. So it's going to be interesting to see what's next for Bernie. He definitely had a very long career. He goes out having won a Stanley Cup, helped the Kings to that Stanley Cup during the 11-12 season. Besides his first taste of NHL action in the first 4 games he got in the 07-08 season, he always had over a 900 save percentage. So he was always a solid goaltender. He always did really well. Towards the end of his career, he was more of a 1A, 1B tandem goalie. But at the start of career, even though he was behind Jonathan Quick, he looked like he could have been a really good starter. So good luck to Bernier. He's had a fantastic career. We wish him best with whatever he's doing next. But definitely a really bad loss for Bernier to go. And after a long career playing with multiple teams, including LA, Toronto, Anaheim, Colorado, Detroit, and Jersey, he has now decided to retire. So going to be interesting to see what's next for him. But long-time goaltender Jonathan Bernier, who's played 12 full seasons at the NHL level, is now retired and is going to be retiring for the NHL. So going to be interesting to see what happens with him next. But Bernier has retired, and he is now no longer in the NHL. So that's the retirement I want to get to here today. going over to some PTOs that have been signed. Now, for all of you who don't know what a PTO is, professional tryout is when some of these UFAs who are sort of fringe NHL players, but they cannot get a two-way contract at the very least, it would be an NHL AHL contract, go to camp on a professional tryout with the club that they sign. They try and show that they're still good enough to be a good NHL forward or defenseman or goaltender. And then if they prove enough that they can still play well at the NHL level, the club or someone else usually signs them to an NHL deal. So player goes to a PTO with that team. They could sign that player after training camp. They could let go of that player if they don't feel that he's ready to get to the NHL. And the team could even let go of a player, and the player could sign with another team if the other team thinks that that player is ready to compete for an NHL roster spot still. So it's going to be interesting to see. Like I said, some players will sign with their clubs that they go to a professional trial with. Some will be let go and not be able to get a new NHL contract and will still have to wait. Some will show enough that they can get a new contract, but those teams may not see fit to sign them to a new NHL contract, or they may have a lot of depth at that position, so they might let them go. And if they do well, another team might end up signing them to a new NHL contract. So it's going to be interesting to see. Last year, there were 42 players who went to training camp on a professional tryout. 12 of those guys wound up getting new deals right out of training camp. So right out of their PTOs, Tyler Pitlick went to training camp with St. Louis and got a contract with St. Louis. Nathan Boileau with Anaheim. Carolina got Calvin DeHaan. Ottawa got Derek Brassard. Carolina also got Derek Stefan. Calgary got Michael Stone. Boston got Anton Strawman. Eric Stahl went to Florida. Daniel Sprong went to Seattle. New York got Jimmy Vesey. Toronto got Zach Aston Reese. And San Jose got Scott Harrington. There were also a couple of other guys who would not get an NHL contract right after their PTO, but would eventually sign a new deal. And those guys were Jason Demers with Edmonton, who would eventually later in the season sign a two-way contract with the Oilers. There was also Sonny Milano, who went to training camp on a PTO with the Calgary Flames. A couple of weeks later would sign with the Washington Capitals. There was also Alex Chiasson, who went to training camp with the Arizona Coyotes. Would have to wait a couple of months, but around the trade deadline would sign a new contract with the Detroit Red Wings. Ben Harper, who took a PTO with Columbus, a couple of weeks later would sign with the New York Rangers. Alex Galchenyuk, who went to training camp with the Colorado Avalanche, would a couple of weeks later sign a two-way deal with the Colorado Avalanche. So there were a couple of guys who didn't immediately get an NHL contract, but there were a couple of guys who did. So it's going to be interesting to see how many players went out getting PTOs this year and how many of them are able to sign with their new clubs after training camp. But we've had announcements of 3 of them, and 3 players have announced that they've been getting PTOs to go to training camp with. First was one that was announced a little while ago, and that is Brendan Sutter was announced to be going to training camp with the Edmonton Oilers. The former Vancouver Canuck and Pittsburgh Penguin has been away from the NHL for a while now. During the shortened season, Sutter suffered a long-term COVID and has had some health problems ever since. So he's been out for a while now. And he missed the entirety of 2 years ago. He missed the entirety of last season. He was on a contract 2 years ago. Last year he was UFA. He didn't get signed. So now he's signed a PTO with Edmonton, hoping that he can get somewhat of maybe like a two-way NHL deal to hopefully be a good bomb 6 forward for Edmonton. So that was a good sign there for Edmonton. Not sure if he'll get an NHL contract, but I definitely think Suter has a shot at getting into NHL role for Edmonton. And then we had some recent ones involving Boston and Carolina. The Hurricanes have announced that they have signed Nathan Boileau to a PTO. So Boileau, a decent depth defenseman, went to training camp last year with Anaheim, wound up getting a deal. I think it's a little bit less likely that he gets a deal with Carolina, given the fact that Carolina has so much depth right now on that team, on the defensive end. If they were to move maybe a guy like Brett Pesce before the season starts, maybe they sign him. But I think if Boileau was to go to training camp and do well, I think it's more likely that he doesn't sign with the Carolina Hurricanes and sign with another team, rather than sign with the Hurricanes. But he's the guy who's going to go into a training camp on a PTO. And then also Alex Chiasson is going to training camp on a PTO with the Boston Bruins. We saw Chiasson go to training camp last year with Arizona on a PTO. He wound up signing late in the season with Detroit. wasn't able to find an NHL contract this year, so he's once again going to training camp on a PTO. Decent bottom six forward. With the lack of cap space and the need for some more offensive abilities for Boston, I do think there stands a good chance Chiasson could wind up going to Boston after training camp, but it's going to be interesting to see. I think there's a strong chance that Chiasson could wind up getting an NHL contract. So going to be more PTOs over the next couple of weeks as we get closer to training camp, but as we know right now, Brendan Sutter in Edmonton, Nathan Boileau in Carolina, and Alex Chiasson in Boston are all going to training camp on a PTO. So going to be interesting to see how those guys do in training camp and see if they can get a two-way NHL contract before the season starts. And lastly, going over to the trade rumor part of the video here today. So we've got a couple of trade rumors I want to discuss here. First, we'll start with the Nashville Predators. There have been a couple of reports I've seen recently saying that maybe not right now, but at some point this season, there's an extremely likely chance the Nashville Predators wind up moving Tyson Barrie before the trade deadline. So it's going to be interesting to see. I don't think this is a trade that happens specifically before the season starts. I think there's an extremely likely possibility that the Preds go into the season without Barrie being moved by the Nashville Predators and being a part of the Preds decor. But I think there's an extremely likely possibility that eventually Barrie will be moved by the Nashville Predators. Barrie's a solid top four defenseman. He showed Edmonton he's an extremely elite offensive defenseman. So I think there will be a lot of interest in him. If the Preds were to retain about half of his salary, it'll bump it down from $4.5 million to $2.25 million. Barrie at $2.25 million for a contender would be a fantastic steal. So I think there would be a lot of interest in him. And the Preds still have some pretty decent right-shot defensemen. They still have Alex Carrier, who's also going to be UFA, and I could see being moved as well. And then they also have Dante Fabro and Luke Shen, who they recently just signed. So I think there will be some fantastic interest in Barrie. I think at the start of the season, they'll start with him. They'll keep him on the top four. They'll keep him as a right shot defenseman. They'll try and boost his value. But the Predators are not a team who's going to be making a ton of noise in the postseason this year. In my opinion, the 8th spot in the West is wide open, and there's a lot of teams who could go and get it, and I think Nashville could be one of them. But I also think there's a likely chance that the Preds are a team who does not make the playoffs this year. So if the Preds are hovering around the wildcard position, or just a little bit out, or maybe even just a tiny bit above the wildcard position, around this year's trade line, I think there's an extremely likely chance that a UFA like Tyson Barrie, who's going to be entering the final year of his deal this year, winds up getting moved by the deadline. So it's going to be interesting to see, but I expect Barrie to be a name to watch out for. Maybe not right now, as I think that the Preds are content with going into the season with Barrie being on their team. But I think around the deadline, if they're not doing overly well, or if they're still on the outside looking in, closer to the trade line, I definitely think there's a likely chance that Barrie winds up getting moved by the Preds. So going to be interesting to see, but I really do think that Barrie does get moved by a Preds at some point this season. It's just going to be interesting to see what point. I still think it'll be closer around the deadline. I also think a guy like Alex Carrier in Nashville could also be a guy who gets moved. Younger forward, but also shown he can have some really good offensive abilities. Entering the final year of his deal, going to be UFA next year. Quite possible he doesn't sign an extension to remain with Nashville. So once again, just like Barrie, I think Carrier could also be a really good option to be traded around the deadline. So going to be interesting to see, but keep your eye on Barrie and Carrier. Maybe not right now, but somewhere closer to the deadline. If the Preds aren't doing too well, I think those two are very likely candidates to be moved at the trade deadline. Going over to the Montreal Canadiens now, when discussing the Jeff Petrie trade that he made a little while ago, GM Kent Hughes said that he told Casey DeSmith to be patient and that he's not 100% sure that DeSmith will be remaining a Montreal Canadien. It sounds like DeSmith is still possibly being mentioned as a trade chip for the Canadiens. Canadiens have 4 good goaltenders in Allen, Primo, Montembeault, and DeSmith, so there's a lot of talk they can move one of those goalies. There's some talk that it'll most likely be DeSmith being flipped to another team. If DeSmith isn't flipped, then a lot of people do think that a guy like Jake Allen could be moved. So it's quite possible it's going to be one of those two guys. It's also quite possible one of those two guys get moved before the season starts. So it's going to be interesting to see. If you look at DeSmith, he makes $1.8 million. He has 1 year left. He showed last year he can be a really good backup goaltender, maybe even a 1B. So I think there would be some teams interested in having DeSmith as like their backup. A team that comes to mind will be the Chicago Blackhawks. They don't have a fantastic goaltending core. Currently, at this point in time, they'd be going to the season with a guy like Peter Mrazek and Arvid Soderblom as their 2 goaltenders. We know they were trying to get a little more competitive for Bedard. I think adding the Smiths to be a DeSmith-Mrazek tandem, I think will be a fantastic addition. So I could see the Hawks have some interest. The Canucks, at this current point in time, they have Demko, who's a fantastic NHL starter, but they also don't have too much of a backup. They have Solov, who I think will be a good backup, but not at this point in time. I think he needs another year in the AHL. They have Spencer Martin, who showed last year that if there's an injury to Demko, he cannot be handled with starting roles. So I think Martin could be a decent third stringer, but I don't think he's a consistent NHL backup. So in my opinion, I could still see a Canucks trying to add a backup goaltender. I think DeSmith would be a fantastic backup goaltender to help with a guy like Thatcher Demko. On top of those two guys, I could also see Tampa have some interest. I know they don't have too much cap space, but if the Canadiens were able to retain about $900,000 on that deal, bump it down to $900,000, DeSmith at $900,000 would be a fantastic addition for Tampa, and it would be a major upgrade on the current backup position, which is Jonas Johansson. So, in my opinion, if the Lightning can make it work cap-wise, I think it'll be a fantastic addition to get DeSmith. But it's going to be interesting to see, as they don't have too much cap space to work with right now, so it's going to be interesting to see. And then I also think that a team like Buffalo would have some interest. Buffalo has 3 goaltenders in their system already in Comrie, Luukkonen, and Levi. Levi seems to be a good starter at this point in time, but they could use a veteran backup who could really help him get accustomed to the NHL. So I think DeSmith, maybe a possible DeSmith or Comrie trade would be good. I think it would be a lot easier to move Comrie on waivers, and Comrie doesn't have as much value, so they could probably still get an asset for Buffalo if the Canadiens were to trade him there. But I think DeSmith will be a decent backup goaltender to Levi, and will definitely help him take off some of the pressure. So, like I said, I still think Levi and Luukkonen could be a decent tandem, but I still think that they could still go after a backup. So whether it be Buffalo, Tampa, Vancouver, Chicago, or another team, I definitely think there's a lot of teams who would be interested in DeSmith, and possibly even Allen. So Canadiens are going to be an interesting team to watch out over the next couple of weeks. I think they are going to move a goaltender at some point. Next, we go over to the Anaheim Ducks. There was a couple of athletic articles I've seen suggesting that the Anaheim Ducks could wind up having forward Adam Henrique be a trade target closer to the deadline of the Edmonton Oilers. Now, the Oilers, like we know, are most likely going to be a playoff team this year. Unless something drastic happens, they should be a top 3 team in the Pacific, one of the better teams in the West. We know they like to add some pieces around the trade deadline to improve their team, and it sounds like Adam Henrique could be a possible option for them. Henrique's a solid middle 6 forward. He's not as good as he used to be, but he's coming off a pretty good season, even though he had some injury troubles. He's entering the final year of his deal with Anaheim, so he'd be a rental. It would not cost too much. I think he makes just over $5.8 million at this point in time, so it'd be, if the Ducks were to retain 50% of his salary, they'd be able to bump it down to just under $3 million. It would still be a pretty difficult trade to make. Oilers, maybe they get a third team involved, bump the cap down even more. But I could definitely see the Oilers have some interest in Henrique. He could definitely be a good solid middle 6 forward. If there's injuries, he could be a solid third-line center. He could also be a solid middle 6 winger. He could definitely do well playing with some of those other players in Edmonton, like McLeod or Draisaitl or RNH or Hyman. So there's definitely a couple of options there for the Oilers, but I definitely think it would be a smart move to target Henrique closer towards the trade deadline. He's a solid middle 6 forward. If they can work it out cap-wise and they can give Anaheim what they want in a trade package, I think there would be some interest in there for Edmonton to pull off a trade to get Henrique. So that's going to be interesting to see. It's not something that'll happen overly soon. It'll be something closer to a trade deadline, but I definitely think Henrique in Edmonton could be a fantastic fit. And as much as he's a really good player, he's entering the final year of his contract, he'd be a rental. If they can make the cap work, it would not be overly expensive to acquire him as well. So, in my opinion, that would be a fantastic deal for the Oilers. If they could get Henrique, play him their bottom 6, being a really good depth scorer, I think that would be a fantastic addition for the Oilers. So definitely going to be interesting to see, but something we'll have to keep our eye on closer to the trade line. And lastly, you're talking about the Calgary Flames. Sportsnet's Pat Steinberg recently has been discussing a couple of things with the Calgary Flames, and said that the reason why guys like Hanifin and Backlund at this point in time have not been traded yet is because of underwhelming offers that the Flames have been given. Now, Backlund making $5.2 million. Steinberg said that at this point in time, the Flames have not gotten really great offers for him. So it sounds like there is interest in Backlund, but not to the interest level that the Flames have wanted it to be at. So it's quite possible they start the season and go into the season with Backlund as their center. I think with the way it's shaping up right now, if Lindholm does extend, Backlund may wind up being moved. He's a solid second or third line center. At this point in time, maybe a third line center behind Kadri and Lindholm and Calgary. But I think he can still be a solid second or third line center in another team. So I definitely do think that there'll still be some interest in him. Maybe closer towards the trade line. If the Flames aren't doing overly good, they can move him for a decent pickup. Like I said, his cap hit is about over $5 million. He just has career season. He doesn't usually hit over 50, 60 points. So he's not an overly productive guy. And his cap hit does not warrant that sort of a trade value. So with the cap hit being so high and him coming off a career season, but only the first time he's had a really high point total, I definitely see the reason why there's not too much interest in Backlund. So it seems likely like Backlund will start the season with Calgary. Like he said, he's not opposed to extending. He just doesn't want to extend before the season starts. So if Calgary does well, maybe he signs a long extension for a couple more years in the offseason. If Calgary's not doing too well at the trade line, maybe they trade him, move him to another team for a decent package closer to the deadline when there's some more better offers. But it definitely seems like the low-balling offers for Backlund are what's keeping him in Calgary right now. And it seems like, unless there's a change in offers, which is always a possibility, it sounds like Backlund will remain a Calgary Flame for the foreseeable future. And same thing with Hanifin. It sounds like there's been some underwhelming trade offers for Noah Hanifin so far, which is why there hasn't been a trade yet. It sounded like there were supposed to be some better offers for the Flames after Erik Karlsson was dealt, but it hasn't happened yet. So I definitely still do wonder if we do get some better offers closer to training camp. Maybe there's an injury or two that happens. Maybe some teams see Hanifin playing well and they want to trade for him. I still think there's a likely option that Hanifin does get moved before the season starts because, once again, like I said in my last video, I still can't see Hanifin and Lindholm being unsigned going into the season. It's too risky for the Flames. So I still think there's a possibility Hanifin gets moved before the season starts. But I think as we closer and closer we get to the start of the season, it seems like it gets more and more likely like Hanifin may start the season with the Flames and just like Backlund be a possible in-season acquisition for a team. So it's going to be interesting to see, but I definitely think if there's some interest in Hanifin and Hanifin possibly gets shipped off to a team, I still think it's possible. It seems like there's some underwhelming offers right now, and until those offers get a little bit better for Calgary, they're not going to hit the switch to trade him. I definitely think there could be some teams interested still. Like, I still think Buffalo's interested. I could still see Florida having interest. There's been some recent linkage from Hanifin to teams like Dallas, Mini, and Nashville in the West. I also think there could be some teams who are in on Karlsson who could still have some interest, like maybe Toronto, maybe Seattle. So I still think there's some teams interested in a guy like Noah Hanifin. So it seems like offers right now are underwhelming for Hanifin, but I think that could change in the not-too-distant future as we get closer to training camp. So going to be interesting to see, but it sounds like underwhelming offers for Backlund and Hanifin are the main reason like they haven't been dealt yet. And unless those change in the not-too-distant future, and they get better, it seems like both those guys will be starting the season as members of the Calgary Flames. So, going to be interesting to see, but I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments on all that was discussed today. What do you think about the PTOs, the signings, and Barrie retiring? Do you see Nashville trading Barrie closer to the deadline? What sort of a trade package do you think they could get, especially if they were to retain 50% of his contract? And what sort of a team do you think would be willing to acquire him? Do you see the Canadians moving a goaltender before the season starts? Is it DeSmith? Is it Allen? And where do you think one of those two could go before the season starts? Do you see Henrique being an option as a trade target closer to the deadline for Edmonton? I think that's a really likely possibility. I think that could be a very likely solution for Edmonton to get some more depth scoring. Definitely love to hear your thoughts on that, as well as what do you think happens with Backlund and Hanifin? Do Backlund and Hanifin both start the season as unsigned UFAs going into the season? Does one of them get moved before the season starts? Or do both of them get moved before the season starts? Or are they both more deadline deals for the Calgary Flames? Definitely love to hear your thoughts down in the comments. But that's all I'm going to talk about for today. Remember to like this video, and if you really liked it, remember to subscribe down below. I also do a blog talking about news, rumors, analysis, stuff like that, so definitely check that out. I have a link down in the description below, and I can't wait to see you guys all for the next video. See you guys soon.